Howdy, folks. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, The Mighty Bjorn, and today for you, got a bit of a Dungeons Dragons video. This is actually a video I'm kind of returning to, as I've discussed doing a video about this previously. Now, with that being said, while this is primarily a discussion in my mind focused on Dungeons and Dragons, it really will go along and work with any fantasy TTRPG, and you'll see here why in a moment. But let me really quick, I want to just take and plug my YouTube channel, folks. Do a lot of D&D content and different types of gaming content around here, and I definitely really appreciate the help. So like, comment, subscribe, that kind of stuff really helps me out as a YouTuber because honestly, I'm getting sick of being backburnered by the YouTube algorithm. And with that being said, for anyone who wants to provide any additional support, I do have a Patreon page. You can check it out down below. There's a link in the video description that you can check out. But now the returning subject is today's video is going to be castle construction. I did a video on general medieval construction previously, and I mentioned that I wanted to do another video on just castle construction because castle construction is a bit more complex and there's a lot of nuances and things of that nature to it. And understand too, with this video, I'm only going to be kind of diving into like the basics of castle construction, but they'll should give you a pretty good baseline idea of creating castles for your fantasy role playing setting. And with all that being said, this is going to be focused on medieval European type castles. There's other castles out there with that's going to share some similarities in construction, but there's also going to be some many differences, such as if you look at feudal Japan castles, they're going to be kind of different compared to a medieval European castle. So this is just going to be really on medieval European castles. Now, the next thing I want to point out too when discussing castles is I feel like there's a lot of misconception out there about what a castle is, just as a general. And I would say this has to do with stories, this has to do with fantasy role play games, video games, movies, etc. And that everybody believes a castle has to be this huge thing that's got a moat and a drawbridge and battlements and blah, blah, blah. And they're made of stone and they're immaculate. And that's actually further from the truth. Now, the previous image that you saw was a medieval European castle. It's a fantasy castle. This image here is also a castle. This is considered a castle. Now, me personally, I kind of consider something like this as more like a keep, but by technical terms, it is a castle. Um, so I really think the next thing to really try to answer is what is a castle? And I guess really the best place to start with is the definition of what a castle is. And as you can see, it is a noun, blah, blah, blah. A large building, typically of medieval period, fortified against attack with thick walls, battlements. It's interesting how battlements is underlined. Towers, and in many cases, a moat. And moat is also underlined. Now, there's a couple snippets here. Um, that's not really quite a perfect definition because not all castles have battlements, even though battlements are very common. Most castles is either a tower or has towers, and in many cases a moat. Not all castles have moats, and it's a real coin flip if many castles had moats actually. Many of them may have had ditches, but an actual moat with like water and all that stuff is kind of different. But we'll get into that. And even with the case with thick walls, as in many cases lumber would be used. Now, a sub definition here, a magnificent and imposing old mansion, Castle Howard. Now, I like how it puts Castle Howard there as a kind of like a baseline or an example, if you will. And with that being said, this is a picture of Castle Howard. I was very curious of what Castle Howard looked like. And yes, when I Googled it, this is the image I found of Castle Howard. And yes, that is very imposing. I don't know if I want to argue about how defendable this building would be, although it does have thick walls, and I'm sure the building has been modified quite a bit since it's been built. It's just those large windows and doors really throw me off on how effective you can consider this a castle, because castles are essentially generally built within mind of being a defendable structure. Now, with that being said, here is an artist render of Castle Howard, and it does actually have defensive walls and towers and things of that nature. So it might be actually more of a castle than I anticipated it being. To be honest, I would actually like to take more of my personal time and study more about Castle Howard and find out more about its history when it was constructed and things of that nature. I suspect this is a much later period castle, maybe towards the Renaissance. We're talking like late gunpowder era. I'm not exactly sure when it was built, but this is definitely not a medieval period castle, or at least it doesn't look like a medieval period castle. But either ways, I would argue it would be a hardened structure meant for defense. With that being in mind, understand that castles also act as a residence for either the prince, the king, the duke, the count, whoever. It's not just a defendable structure, it is also a home. So I want to keep that in mind as well. You know, a castle is where the king is going to hold court, etc. And then generally, that is where they're going to live. Now, the next thing I would mention, I feel is important in the sense of a castle, is defensive walls. May have battlements or whatever. These are actually technically not battlements. I will get into what they are here in a little bit, but they're sort of kind of a battlement, but not the type of battlement that people tend to think of. Now, with that being said, once again, I want to highlight that castles can be constructed out of wood. This is also considered a castle, and this is another wooden castle. And then it does actually have many features that a castle has. Believe it or not, the walls are actually defendable. And this kind of has something I want to point out here in a bit, which is a Machiko Lantern. Yeah, I believe that's how it's pronounced. It kind of throws me off a little bit on how that's pronounced, but either ways, that this actually also has that. So this is actually a pretty defendable structure. Also, if you notice there, it's got a very small area leading up to the door itself. The door is actually not on the ground. You actually have to climb stairs to get to the door, and it's also got very small windows to use for archers. Now, another thing I want to point out with general castle construction, and I would say this is probably one of the most important features when it comes to your fantasy setting and when you design your castle. Your castle is going to be on the high ground. Whatever area it's in, no matter if it's on a set of plains or whatever, it's going to be on the highest ground possible. That does seem to be a standard among all castles, which makes sense. Trying to climb up a hill with a bunch of combat gear on is a bit more difficult. And it's also going to make other things more difficult, such as trying to get rams uphill and other heavy siege equipment to try and lay siege to the castle. So it only makes sense that it's up on the hill. Also, with it being up on the hill, gives it a very good viewpoint of enemy movement. So I would argue that is a very important feature, and that seems to be a pretty standard feature across the board that kind of every castle follows. Now, next thing that many castles have is some type of moat or ditch, either natural or otherwise. Sometimes the moats are natural. Sometimes they are man-made, where maybe they run kind of like kind of like an aqueduct or something along those lines to essentially from a lake to a man-made ditch that acts as a moat. Sometimes you will just have essentially a ditch, and that ditch might be full of something like punji spikes or something along those lines, or it may just be a really deep, steep ditch that's going to be difficult for enemy forces to cross. And usually, when there's a moat involved, there's either going to be a drawbridge to cross the moat, or there's going to be a very narrow, almost walking, kind of like a single or two-person width bridge. It's going to be a very narrow bridge, making it difficult for any en masse forces to cross. Now, another thing that does seem to be pretty standard across the board is arrow slits and windows. Now, with that being said, in most cases, there is no glass in the windows, but it is quite typical to have arrow slits throughout, throughout your battlements, or sorry, throughout your towers, throughout the defensive walls, and even the castle itself, is that you have here. Basically, they have multiple arrow slits, and even though those arrow slits look really narrow, they're kind of it's kind of a fool's game here, if you will, with the arrow slits, where they're kind of narrow on the outside and they look really narrow on the outside, but actually they give a pretty good field of view from the inside. So if you're inside looking out, you have a pretty good field of view, and you also usually have a lot of room to maneuver. And that's because when a lot of these castles were built with these arrow slits, they were built in mind for longbows or short bows, more often not longbows. And then even when you look at later periods, even when you start looking at crossbows, you need room to maneuver around that crossbow and be able to use it fairly freely to keep up essentially peak efficiency with your archers that's defending your castle. Now, the next thing to cover is battlements and the Ma Chick Latin. Laton. Good Lord, I cannot pronounce that right. It's so weird. But essentially, battlements, it's just more defensive area, usually on top of your defensive walls and your towers, that essentially your soldiers can use as cover. Also, then you have the Ma Chick stuff. I don't even want to pronounce that word again. But essentially, it's a section of the battlements, as you can see here, kind of sticks out from the wall. And there's basically big holes in the bottom of them. And that is so soldiers could throw rocks, could shoot arrows, could pour boiling water. Believe it or not, boiling oil was not very common. This whole idea of boiling oil or boiling tar and pouring it on top of enemy troops during a siege, that research kind of indicates that's more of a Hollywood thing than something that actually happened. But yeah, boiling water on top of enemy troops that's trying to scale the walls, that's what these are. It's actually to provide direct support going down the wall against enemy forces trying to breach the wall or maneuver across your walls. Now, the next thing that castles could have, and would actually probably be a fairly common feature, would be some type of siege equipment itself. May it be ballistas, catapults, or in this case, cannons. Black Powder era, you're definitely going to be seeing more and more cannons over ballistas and other types of siege of equipment like catapults and trebuchets. But you're also going to have that, and you're going to have that. You're going to have a limited number of that, especially when you start looking at catapults and trebuchets because of how much room they take. But essentially, it's anti-siege artillery, if you will. When the enemy starts lobbing siege artillery at you, you lob siege artillery back, is generally the idea. Now, the next thing I want to point out is glass windows. Glass windows doesn't seem to be a very common thing in castles. I kind of wonder if some instances that I see glass windows or photos of castles with glass windows, if it was something that was added later after the fact when essentially the castle was really no longer being used as a castle. And and particularly stained glass. Glass was very expensive in the medieval period. Understand that it was very complex and hard to make, difficult to make glass. And the problem is with glass windows is, well, glass windows didn't really open at the time. So it kind of makes it difficult to defend the castle if you can't really attack from the windows. So essentially, glass windows, I think, is something more or less something that you see on later period castles, Renaissance castles, things of that nature, and then any castles older than that that so happen to have glass windows, it's probably a retrofit. So I would more or less for your Dungeons and Dragons campaign, I would assume or want to assume that you should not have actual panes of glass over the windows. And then right here is just a really good picture of like the anatomy of a castle, the keep, the bailey, the curtain wall, the battlements, etc. So this is a good photo that if you want, you might want to grab a quick screenshot of this, save it, and use it for your own future use. And actually, what's interesting is this castle actually has some other structures within it. There's probably like a supply depot there, a guardhouse, and it looks like maybe there's a temple. There's probably also stables, maybe a garden. So something to think about when it comes to designing your castles for your Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Now, when it comes to castle construction itself, it was a quite long, drawn out process. It would take several months, maybe even a few years to actually build castles. The castles themselves would typically be built out of brick and mortar or stone and mortar. Um, some castle walls I found were actually nothing more than stacked stone, where they would actually stack and cut and fit the stone in and kind of make it so it interlocks with itself over using stone and mortar. But as you get to the mid medieval period and late medieval period, they're basically building castles out of brick and mortar at that point, or stone and mortar. And also they're still using also wood. Now, with that being said, what you're seeing here is actually essentially a very complex crane and scaffolding system. If you look at the left side of the photo, those two giant round wheels is actually a crane system or an elevator, if you will. And then this stuff would actually, once the castle construction is complete, all this would actually be removed. So if you ever go looking at photos of castles and you see holes, like square holes or rectangular holes in the castle walls, that's actually from the bracing from the scaffolding system that was used while the castle was being constructed. And so you can see how the crane would be used. A person would actually climb into the wheel and walk, and as they walked, it would lift and lower, and basically it would be based on what direction they walked. And they would actually have people dedicated to essentially walking back and forth in giant hamster wheels all day long, lifting and lowering different supplies during a castle's construction. Now, with that being said, really quickly, when it comes to the different materials that would be used for constructing a castle, understand that more than likely a lot of it would be based on what they have locally available. So if they're very limited on stone, they might not attempt to build the castle at all out of stone or use any stone for the castle's construction, or even still use a very limited amount of stone, especially if they have a lot of lumber available. Also, things like wealth and things of that nature also comes into play, because obviously working with stone is going to be a lot more expensive than working with wood, so on and so forth. Now, with that being said, another thing about castles is castles would typically have a village nearby it. May it be attached to the castle, kind of in this sense, where you have like one huge defensive wall, and then inside you have a smaller defensive wall with a village that leads up to a drawbridge, that leads up to another defensive wall, which leads to the castle keep itself. So this is one way you might see it, or you might see something where you have a castle on one side of a river and across the river is a village, things of that nature. But normally you're going to have a village very close by to the castle, or even essentially right next to it. But anyway, folks, think I'm going to wrap today's video up at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed learning more about castle construction, and hopefully it will help you out and influence you on how you design your castles for your Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Thank you very much for tuning in. And please take a few moments, share this video around. You never know who's going to watch it, and any boost I can get does help me combat against YouTube. Anyway, folks, have yourself a wonderful day.